Live from Chattanooga, Tennessee, it's Nooganomics with David Tulis.
It's hard to think of local economy in the free market at the university campus, but it belongs there too. And we like to see voluntary relationships among people at a university. We want there to be everyone there looking to learn, looking to study, making the most of their tuition expenses at the university, so that when they leave with their papers, they will be entrepreneurs. They'll be the best employees of businesses. They'll go on to serve the public in business or the nonprofit sector, or maybe in church life or volunteer positions. Local economy exists there too. But what happens when the state turns certain people unknown to you into snitches? There was a story in the Chattanooga Times Free Press in the Friday editions, which I hope you, my listener, saw. A very important story that came out in some length in that newspaper on page B3. And the Friday's editions. And it tells about the Alabama drug snitch story, and one that I have no doubt is taking place here as well, where young men and young women are crowbarred into serving the state, serving the forces of prohibition by threats, loud arguments, and a kind of oral violence. Hang on just a second. Yes, indeed. You give us 12 minutes and 40 seconds, and we will convey to you the world. And that is what we do here at AM 1240 Hot News Talk Radio. And my name is David Tulis, and we want to find out about this drug snitch program around the country. We have it here, without doubt, I say, in Chattanooga at Chat State and at UTC. There's not been original reporting on it. And so what we want to do is hear a little bit about what's going on in Alabama and elsewhere from an activist who knows this field. She represents the Students for Sensible Drug Policy in Washington. She's the executive director of this organization, and her name is Betty Aldworth. Betty, tell us about the drug snitch program, how it works, and how my listener's son, who is right now a student at UTC, might come across this mysterious program run by the so-called war on drugs.
Well, let's be really clear, first and foremost, that, when we use the term snitch, that implies something very specific, right? That implies a drug dealer who's heavily involved in the illicit market and has some kind of information that they might be able to impart about people higher up the chain. And we all think about, when we hear the word snitch, something, someone a bit more nefarious, whether or not we believe that drugs should be legal or illegal, that's the thing that comes to mind. When we're talking about the confidential informant program on these college campuses, these are young people, some of whom don't use drugs, who are wrapped into a system when they're vulnerable, when they are unable to stand for their own rights, and who are compelled, outside of any kind of reason, if you ask us, to participate in a program that is incredibly dangerous. And so here at SSDP, we don't use that term because it implies something that these young people are not. These are your sons and daughters who are perhaps busted with half a gram of cannabis, as little as that, or very low-level possession amounts of drugs, who are not arrested and therefore not informed of their rights, and are coerced by law enforcement through threat to work against their friends and their peers on campus in order to try and bust, what the police are referring to as drug rings, but which are really just young people being young people.
All right. So the word, let me be correct there. The word snitch implies, of course, a malevolent intent on the part of the person who's conveying information about actors in the marketplace back to police departments or police handlers. And the word snitch is kind of condemning the activity. And I guess you at Students for Sensible Drug Policy would condemn the activity, but not the person who's sort of trapped into being a spy.
Well, we think that fundamentally drugs ought to be regulated for health, safety, and many other reasons. And so disagree with the notion that, that the provision of drugs is, empirically wrong, and recognize the fact that on college campuses, oftentimes friends are sharing with friends, and that does not constitute a drug network that justifies the kind of involvement by police that we see happening on campuses across the nation, and particularly in the South.
Well, tell us about the danger to the individual. My listener's son, as I say, is a student at UTC. Narrate how it is he is wrangled into being a betrayer of his friends, a betrayer of classmates in his biology class, or the engineering class that he has in the morning. There's someone there whom he's going to betray. How is it that my listener's son is crowbarred into that very difficult and hot position? How does that happen?
Sure. So in the most common of circumstances, one of his friends will have been enlisted as a confidential informant. And that young person will be tasked with, doing a certain number of drug buys. That friend is probably not going to actually know any drug dealers. So they're going to go to their friends who they know consume most commonly cannabis. And so your friend's son, who might have a little bit of cannabis in his dorm room or in his apartment, will be encouraged to sell, some portion of that for personal use, even though he's not a drug seller. And in the course of what is essentially sharing with his friends, he will be busted as well for possession and sale of cannabis. He's then going to be picked up by the police, and he's going to be taken to the station, isolated from friends, family, and trusting adults, not given an opportunity to speak to a lawyer, and he will be told that he will be facing tremendous penalties, including jail time and extraordinary fines, loss of education, loss of his liberty, if he does not comply with this confidential informant program, become an informant himself, and do a certain number of drug buys. Now, here's where it gets really ugly for young people, and that is he will be tapped to go do more of these buys himself. And he might be able to do the same thing that his friend did, which is find a few people he knows who smoke pot on occasion and do low-level purchases and get his friends in trouble along with him. But in some cases, in many cases, he will be coerced into operating far outside of his level of experience. And that's something that we've seen on numerous occasions. 60 Minutes did a piece a couple weeks ago on this program, and we learned about an SSDP alumni member, Rachel Hoffman, and then another young man out of Minnesota. And in both of these cases, they were forced to interact with drug dealers who were part of the violent cartel market. And in both cases, these young people lost their lives. In Rachel's case in Florida, she was busted with a relatively small amount of drugs, considering the size of the illicit drug market. And she was forced to make a $13,000 purchase of cocaine and other drugs and a gun. The police had her set up this purchase, which was so far outside of her experience that she wasn't able to handle it properly, or couldn't possibly have handled it in any kind of knowledgeable way. And she was killed with the gun that she was supposed to purchase during this transaction, and her body was found days later. Rachel was 23 years old. She was busted with a little bit of personal use, a little bit of drugs for personal use.
What was her major?
There's no reason that she should have lost her life for that. And that is happening on campuses across America every single day. This
is David Tulis. We're talking with Betty Aldworth from Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Betty, what was the major of that student Rachel who was shot dead in a drug buy? She was 23 years old at a university. What was she studying? Who was she? And what came of that case?
Well, Rachel was a member of SSDP before I was part of SSDP, and I never had the opportunity to know her. She had recently graduated and was, well on her way to becoming a full-fledged adult when that was interrupted by the police who enlisted her to be a confidential informant. So unfortunately, I never had the chance to meet her. But this is, like I said, happening to young people across the nation every day.
Well,
and it could be, the important thing to note here is that it could be anybody's kid. And you will never know. If you are a parent, you will never know if this is your kid, because one of the things that the police do is make sure that your child is terrified to tell anyone what is happening. So they aren't able to talk to a trusted adult like a parent. They aren't able to talk to an attorney. They don't find out what their rights really are or what the possible ramifications are of this drug bust.
So I guess the way of legal advice for that student would be, am I under arrest and am I being detained? And if the answer is yes, that student should follow the ACLU guidelines for interactions with police departments. And that is to say, I make no statement, or I make no statement apart from the presence of an attorney, and take that. But when they are manhandled sort of outside of arrest and not even told that they're under arrest, but are in fact under arrest, they yield to coercion. Betty Aldworth.
Yes, they do, and this is a big problem. The police are trained in convincing people that they need to talk before they know their rights, and they need to make agreements before they know their rights. But the fact of the matter is, if a young person is brought in on a simple possession charge or even a low-level distribution charge, they are not going to be facing the kinds of penalties that the police are threatening them with. They're not going to be facing mandatory minimums. It's a prosecutor who's going to make that decision, and half the time, well, that's not a statistical fact, but very frequently, they might not even be charged. They might need to go to a treatment class or two, but instead they have their lives and their well-being threatened on campus because of these confidential informant programs when they get signed up.
Well,
so what a young person needs to do if they are arrested, and what we need to be educating our college students about, and not even college, I mean, there are confidential informants out there 12 and younger. What we need to be educating young people about is their rights in a police encounter, and make sure that they understand that they can ask for an attorney, that they should demand to be able to talk to their parents, that they should, or another trusted adult, that they don't have to make this decision alone. And until they're actually talking to a prosecutor, they should not be making any kind of agreement to become a confidential informant.
The story that's in the Chattanooga Times-Free Press on Friday's editions leads off with a story of a young man named Ryan, University of Alabama student, and he says, it was a lot of threats just trying to scare me, and I was 19 at the time, and I had never even had a speeding ticket. And he goes on to say they were yelling at me and saying if I didn't help them, they were going to screw me and my friends over. And so the advice of Students for Sensible Drug Policies, Betty Aldworth, whom we have here on the phone, this is David Tulis, is that if you, my listener, or your son are at the university and are kind of caught up in a vice, if you will, by police, that you ask for the essentials and do the essentials, namely what, Betty? Make no statement, demand an attorney, and not submit to interrogation.
Make no statements and demand an attorney, and absolutely, that is correct. The very first thing you should ask is, am I under arrest? Once you're already in custody. Now, of course, we know that, frequently in the course of a police encounter, folks need to be real careful about the assertion of their rights, and make sure that they are doing so politely. Because we've had a gross number of tragedies in police encounters of late, especially for young people. But, politely and firmly assert your rights, ask for an attorney, even if you're not under arrest, and do not make any agreements until you've talked to a trusted adult.
Right, no statements, no agreements. Every single parent of
a college student should be talking about this, because this program is enormous and invasive, and it's on every single campus, including those in Tennessee, University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, Chat State, and everywhere else.
Now, does Students for Sensible Drug Policy have a state chapter, Betty Aldworth?
We do. We have a presence on, I believe, 5 campuses in Tennessee, including in Memphis and at University of Tennessee at Chattanooga as well.
Now, the story that we read about in the Chattanooga Times-Free Press tells about a 2013 raid, if you will, at the University of Alabama, and there were 61 students and about a dozen non-student people swept up in a massive drug raid, as it was reported. Tell us about that. How do police let cases build up and have big raids? Is that something that might be ahead here? What seems to be the practice in gathering numbers of people and busting them all at once, Betty?
Sure. I mean, this is something that happens all the time. We see it very regularly, and then we see, cops standing in behind tables full of drugs and guns and money, and folks cheer on these giant drug arrests and get excited that there are X million dollars not on the street anymore, and so many drug kingpins behind bars, and that's the narrative that police are using in situations like this. But when we're talking about kids on campus, that's not what the reality is. But regardless, that counts as a drug arrest, and that counts, for the quotas and the statistics for that police department. And I'll tell you what, busting up a group of friends or a group of acquaintances on a college campus who are sharing some cannabis or trading it amongst themselves is a hell of a lot easier than busting up an actual drug ring.
This is David Tulis.
We should expect to see many of these kinds of busts on campuses across the nation until we end this disgusting practice. All
right, we're talking with Betty Aldworth of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. What's the website right quick, Betty?
It's ssdp.org, or if that's hard to remember, try schoolsnotprisons.org.
Schoolsnotprisons.org. Well, we have an email from a pro-police listener, Betty, and he says he's asking me to have you explain to a parent why his child died of an ecstasy overdose because the police made no arrest. How do you deal with that kind of argument?
Well, first of all, MDMA very rarely causes overdose. It generally, if someone is dying of what we refer to as an ecstasy overdose, it's because it's not actually ecstasy. It's a new psychoactive substance, which is far more dangerous than ecstasy, but is legal because it's a new formulation. And but it's actually far more dangerous. Or they are dying of hypothermia, overheating, because clubs are not permitted to provide water or space to chill when people are experiencing any kind of drug effects because of the Rave Act. So, listen, I understand that we need to be very much concerned about the health and well-being of young people, especially when it comes to drugs. I am very much concerned about this. We have 4,000 student members in our network, all of whom are equally concerned about this question, many of whom have lost friends due to drug overdoses or drug-related events. But the fact of the matter is, young people are going to use drugs. Young people are going to use drugs at rates that we can barely even imagine. At the absolute minimum, the most conservative of estimates, 4 million young people are going to be using, on campuses, 4 million college students are going to be using cannabis this month. 4 million young people are going to be using another drug like ecstasy or Adderall that they're getting off of the, off the illicit market, or any number of other drugs this month. And 8 million of them are going to be consuming alcohol, many of them illegally. The unregulated market, the drug war policies that impede safety instead of promote it, that's what's most dangerous for young people. Is it your view, Betty, that the prohibition against narcotics the federal prohibition be brought to an end? Is that something that my listener should favor? listen, the fact of the matter is the drug war is far more dangerous than drugs themselves. And if we can do a better job of educating young people about drugs and their use and why, you know, drug use initiation should be delayed or prevented, and if they're going to use drugs, how to do so safely. And if we can provide them, you know, with the kinds of interventions that they need in a drug-related emergency without involving the police, then those young people are going to have far better outcomes. Young people everywhere are going to have far better outcomes, and they're actually going to be able to make it out of college. But the ways that we have our drug laws constructed right now put young people in danger. And the confidential informant system is only one example of that.
Well, listen, Betty Aldworth, thank you so much for joining me here at AM 1240 Hot News Talk Radio in Chattanooga.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Betty Aldworth is the Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy in Washington, and contacted us at a conference, and we are favoring local economy, the free markets, and when you have a regulated economy or an economy that's oppressed by the state under a prohibition, what happens is you have astronomically high prices, and you have the biggest risk takers, the biggest risk-taking entrepreneurs involved in it, and those people are called criminals. That's how criminals make their living, by taking the risks that other entrepreneurs won't take, and they're in trafficking in those products. So if we decriminalized the drug market, the marketing stimulants, we would decriminalize much of life, and we would take a great cause of action away from the state, which is the drug war, through which it hounds people and traps people and forces them to be snitches here at UTC, here in the hallways, in the corridors, in the classrooms of Chat State, and maybe Lee University and Covenant College and elsewhere. They're always the agents of the state looking to make a kill, looking to get your kid with that half ounce of cannabis. This is David Tulis.